Welcome back to another video. It's been a minute since my last upload. Got some life changes happening. I've got a trip coming up. I've got a move coming up. That's why the set has changed. We're kind of doing a little bit of a scrappier run and gun setup today. But I'm glad you're here, and we're gonna talk about Portra 800, my first roll in 35mm, doing a shoot. It's kind of a swimwear lifestyle shoot at Golden Gardens in Seattle with a friend. And then we're gonna get into sort of a niche editing technique, I would say, in probably the film world, less so in the digital landscape photography world, which is where I learned this technique. It can be fairly in-depth if you want it to be, and it can be extremely simple. So it's a good starter technique, and you can add a lot of complexity as you get more used to it. But we'll go into 1 to 2 examples, and I'll share my screen with you. We'll get into Lightroom and Photoshop, and hopefully I can explain it pretty quick and have everybody follow along. And we can always dive more into this technique in the future as I refine my film scanning workflow and come across, different challenges and develop different solutions. I want to share those with you guys, and hopefully we can all keep learning about how to make our film scans look better. So I'm excited to get into this today, and let's get started. So we're gonna go really quick on this first section of the video because after all, this is my first roll. So I don't have a huge amount of license to review it extensively, but I do plan on shooting this roll a lot more in the future, and we'll do a more in-depth video then. But my initial thoughts on Portra 800 is just its versatility. It has a fairly fine grain for being 800 speed. It has fantastic skin tones. It has a lot of latitude. It has a very gentle, natural, almost archival quality where it's not too stylized. I'm sure you can scan it to be much more contrasty and punchy, and that's part of the great thing about film these days, is that you can get that punchier tone out of a film like Portra 800, or you can get a nice, smooth, a little bit lower contrast, maybe even softer look. I would say that I chose to process some of the shots on this roll a little bit in between, not super low contrast and not super high either, just a nice middle ground. I love a film that can achieve that middle ground look, because if it can achieve that, then it can kind of carry you to where you want to go. If you'll notice that these 2 images were in my thumbnail, and I'm just so impressed with this film stock. Skin tone is looking super, super soft and natural. Foliage and greens, grass, even something more saturated like, this fruit, something more neutral like a shirt, like whites are really nice. There's a nice kind of like roll off in the highlights. Even if we look at these beach kind of like boulders, there's these subtle warmth and the little bits of green and the color separation from the sand, from the whites of her shirt, from her, her skin tone, and then just the grain structure is really nice. One of the things that really strikes me immediately about Portra 800, and you wouldn't have to necessarily shoot on it to know this, but it seems like a more versatile Portra 400. You can use it in lower light. You can shoot it at higher f-stops because of the added sensitivity. It has fantastic latitude. It has a lot of detail. I'm just essentially very impressed. And if you have not picked up a roll yet, I know it's expensive. do it, try it out, see what you think. Maybe it's like a specialty film for you. Maybe you have a special project or a time or place where, you know, splurging a little bit on something a little bit more professional fits your needs. If you find something that does, I would buy it in a second and use it for that project. I really recommend it. So when is a good time to use double processing as a technique? I would say when a global edit looks really desirable in one place and undesirable in another. And basically what I mean by that is that as you edit a single file, part of the composition you're editing for a very desirable outcome, but it has an adverse influence on another part of the frame. And let's just show you an example of that right now. So if we dive into Lightroom, here's a scan I did of Hannah at Golden Gardens in Seattle. So immediately, what's the desirable outcome of this edit? It's to have this white shirt pop and be bright enough. But the undesirable adverse outcome is that by making this shirt bright enough and adjusting these sliders to do so, I've actually made the sky lose detail and clip information. So by creating a virtual copy, and to do that, you right click and just create virtual copy. Just in case anyone's wondering, I have on this shot recovered detail in the sky with, right, the adverse side effect of making the foreground too dark. Well, that's exactly the type of example that I find double processing to be super useful. This little mini tutorial would go maybe a little too long if I edited these for images from scratch, but just know that this is the original image and this is just a virtual copy that I have edited the one on the left to have desirable outcomes in how much brightness is in the shirt in the foreground, and on the image on the right I have edited so that we maintain a good healthy amount of detail in our sky with not the brightest foreground. I'm going to show you, let's do this. Let's do edit, open as layers in Photoshop. Okay, so here we are on Photoshop. I am going to reverse these layers. I usually like to have my brighter exposure on the bottom, darker exposure on the top. So I can do a much more in-depth Photoshop basics tutorial, but honestly, there's so many good YouTube videos out there like that. But honestly, there's so many great beginner Photoshop YouTube tutorials. They've probably done it better than I can. So I'll tell you what I'm clicking as I go, but if you want a basic Photoshop tutorial, sure, let me know in the comments. Otherwise, I think there's amazing resources out there. I want to put a black layer mask on this top image. So I'm gonna hold Option and click the layer button. That puts a black layer mask. And basically what I'm trying to achieve here is combine these two images in Photoshop with the power of masking techniques. And that is to have some of an image show on one layer and have where that image doesn't show on the other layer. So if we click the brush tool, I'm gonna hold Control and Option and right click and drag. That basically allows me to adjust the size of my brush. If I drag it up and down, that adjusts the hardness. I almost always use a hardness of 0. So another little tip is if you hold Shift and then the number pad, you can see my flow changing at the top right up here. I usually use a flow of 10% and an opacity of 100%. So let's make sure our foreground color is white, and that is like anything that's white reveals on a layer mask and anything that's black conceals. So if the whole layer mask right here is black, then the whole layer is concealed. Let's start painting with a low flow, high opacity on the sky. What that will do is it will reveal our virtual copy of the same raw file that we processed to have more highlight detail. pretty quickly you'll realize that this technique can and often is very, very, very easy and very, very simple. So just by painting for a little bit, we recovered the highlights in the sky, and now we can continue adjusting this image in Photoshop. So we could get quite a bit more in depth on double processing. I think there is a huge opportunity in film scanning if you do it yourself, where you can get very nitty-gritty about the quality of your scans, all the way to treating film scanning almost like a landscape photographer would edit their photos, which is with a lot of Photoshop techniques, a lot of thoughts about maintaining as much dynamic range in your capturing process as possible and your post-production. And I think this is a really unique opportunity for anyone watching this video to realize that you can set yourself apart from the crowd in a lot of ways in how you scan your negatives and how you process them. And double processing a single raw file or a single scan is extremely powerful once you kind of get the understanding of using global edits and local edits. And when you can't achieve everything you desire in a global edit, you create a virtual copy and then you solve for each variable at a time and then combine those in Photoshop with layer masks later. That's basically the premise, and it's extremely powerful, and I highly suggest that you guys give that a try. I can do more of these videos in the future. There's way more opportunities to use double processing with something like making sure your skin tones are dialed in and not messing around with other similar hues and saturation ranges that are in other parts of your image, making sure you have full dynamic range, making sure you have contrast in localized places that are dialed in exactly how you want without messing up contrast in other areas or other parts of, let's say, the zone system, or simply just another way of putting it would be shadows, midtones, and highlights. So that is the very basics of taking one file, realizing that to get, for example, her shirt to pop, it potentially creates a loss of dynamic range in our sky, and the way around that being to create a virtual copy, process it two slightly different ways, right? Let me just select this real quick. Process it two different ways. One is optimized from the foreground, one is optimized for the sky. You right click and you open in layers in Photoshop, and then when you're in Photoshop, you put the darker layer. That's how I do it. I like to put the darker layer on top, put a black layer mask on, grab a white brush with a low flow, high opacity, and just paint to your desired taste. So there we go.